Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the last first Friday of 2023. My name is Whitney Stoll. I'm the DC Post First Vice President, and alongside me is Bree Beal, our Programs Director, and she'll be monitoring our webinar today as well as the chat. So we have over 100 registered participants from all over the world today, so I know you're excited for this program as we are. So please join me in welcoming our panelists for the Developing Audit-Proof Rates, Costs, and Withstanding Federal Audits, who's presented by Fox Rothschild and their panelists from TD Government Solutions and Wessel and Company. So we'll be diving into understanding the requirements and best practices for contractors to manage and ensure compliance for the federal AEC industry, and learning more about the FAR 31 to help you prepare cost rates and hopefully be ready in case there is an audit. But first, I'd like to start our welcome by introducing you to our First Friday series, which is provided to you through SAME's commitment to offering the AEC community effective training, development, and networking programs. The DC Post is helping sustain the future of the profession through these monthly education-focused sessions to deliver topical and relevant content to our industry. So thank you all for joining us here today as we start our program. So please feel free to use the chat to introduce yourself, share your LinkedIn contact information, as well as your email to everyone throughout the presentation. Ask questions so we can address them during our Q&A portion of the event. And this is a lunchtime learning session for those of you joining us on the East Coast, so feel free to eat your lunch during this program. And for those who are joining us, regardless of where you're attending from. And by the way, if you want to know how to save the chat throughout this event, feel free to go to File and then go to Save, and then you can actually hit Chat, and that's how you can actually save the chat on your end. So, but as we kick off all of the SAME events, we start with a moment of silence to remember our active duty military, first responders, and all who need our care and thoughts throughout the world right now. Thank you. And you please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. So I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. We'd like to take a moment to thank all of our DC Post sponsors for their continued support: AMT, Black & Veatch, Christopher Consultants, Consigli, Fox Rothschild, Gannett Fleming, Spinny Yellow, Stantec, WSP, Jacobs, Woods Peacock, AB Facility Service Solutions, Arche Consulting, Prime AE, and Stanley Consultants. So we truly appreciate your support. We could not put on these events without you, and we are grateful for your outstanding sponsorship. So your support helps us meet our society's strategic goals, including providing excellent content for our members, industry and government engagement, building resilient communities, and connecting our future leaders through our student and young member groups, enriching our STEM pipeline, and preparing our military and veterans for life after service. So if you'd like to support our First Friday webinar series as a sponsor, we're starting our 2024 annual sponsorship program, and we'd love to include you as a sponsor in the series, future programs, and other events throughout the year. So please visit our website or reach out to me directly for more information on sponsorship levels and how you can give back to the community. Please note this program will provide one professional development hour through the DC Post. So look for an email with the subject line document delivery from SAME DC and Eventbrite with a copy of our program slides, your PDH certificate, and a list of opt-in attendees who pre-registered for this session. We are recording this webinar and we'll post a video on our website later on. So I'm not going to read through the learning objectives of the slides, since most of you saw the objectives when you did register. And instead, I'm going to introduce the featured panelists and the team in just a minute. So when I do the introduction, if you haven't already, feel free to use the chat where you're calling in from, any contact information, as well as ask any questions throughout the presentation. All right, so we'll answer all the questions in the chat at the end of the program. And so now let's introduce the panelists. So Doug Hipschman is a partner at Fox Rothschild and is leading his panel in today's webinar. So Fox Rothschild is a general practice law firm with over 1,000 attorneys and 29 offices nationwide. And Fox has a robust federal procurement, construction, and AE practice group that represents small, medium, and large contractors and AE firms in all matters of federal contracting issues, including drafting and reviewing contracts, preparing contract claims, filing bid protests, ensuring and implementing compliance protocols, and training and assisting clients with federal cost protocols, rate development, and managing claims against government for payment and representing clients in federal audits. So Doug, thank you for joining us here today. I'm going to have you introduce Dana, Tim, and Jason, the rest of your panelists. So the floor is yours, and I'll let you take it from here.
Thank you, Whitney. Good afternoon, everybody. As Whitney said, my name is Doug Hipschman. With me, I have 3 colleagues today. So you're going to hear from 2 attorneys and 2 consultants. And I've heard some people say that the only thing better than hearing from 1 attorney is hearing from 2. And likewise, the only thing better than hearing from 1 consultant is hearing from 2 consultants today. So you're going to hear from 4 of us today in quick succession. And as Whitney said, if you have questions, please put them in the chat. We're going to try to have some time at the very end to answer those questions. Again, I'm an attorney along with my colleague, Dana Molinari. We work at Fox Rothschild here in Washington, D.C. And one of the things that we do is we represent a lot of A&E firms and construction contractors in helping them understand the FAR, helping them understand specifically FAR Part 31, which is what we're going to talk about today about allowable costs, helping them develop rates and protect rates when they go into an audit. Now, Dana and I we're not CPAs. We're not cost consultants, we're attorneys. We went to law school probably because we were not good at doing numbers. So we work with folks like Tim DeGiuseppe and his colleague Jason Rice, who are cost consultants or CPAs by trade. And when you get to the point where you need help developing rates, we reach out to folks like Tim and Jason to actually help contractors look at their cost accounting system, make sure that it's copacetic, make sure that it can be used to develop very, very solid and defendable rates if you ever get audited, and how to maximize profit and revenue on a federal contract. So that's our team. Tim and Jason will tell you a little bit about themselves when they get started in their portion of the presentation. So Dana, can you go to the first slide, please? Okay, there we go. So we have about 30 slides today, and we're only going to talk about half of those. So some of those are going to be in there for informational purposes only. But the goal of today's presentation, when you walk out of here today, we'd like you to take 3 things with you. Number 1, how do you as a federal contractor, specifically an A&E contractor or a construction contractor, how do you develop what we would refer to as solid, defendable, and allowable costs and rates for federal projects, right? Number 1, how do you do that? How do you develop rates? What are the tips and tricks on doing that? What are some of the best practices to do that? That's number 1. Number 2, how do you develop these rates and costs in such a manner that 1, they're allowable, but 2, that they're also audit proof? And Tim will tell you, my colleague Tim will tell you, there's no such thing as audit proof rates. So we're going to refer to them as quasi audit proof rates. So how do you develop rates to withstand an audit? And number 3, if you walk into an audit, how are you going to feel comfortable with the rates and costs that you've developed? And I did see something in the chat that maybe some folks are having problems seeing the screen. Whitney, are you able to see the screen all right? The slide?
It looks great. Yeah, we see the Capitol at night.
Good deal.
And we got a thumbs up from Ed, so it's coming in
Gotcha.
Across the river in the Commonwealth. So
Gotcha.
We're good.
Thank you. All right, next slide, please, Dana. Okay, let's see here. I've already introduced everybody. Next slide. Okay, so here's our presentation outline. We're going to hit 3 big picture topics with you today. The first is FAR Part 31. What is it? Why do you care? What does it talk about with regard to developing allowable costs? So Dana and myself are going to talk and give you a big picture wave tops overview of FAR Part 31, what it means, what it says, why do you have to comply with it, and why do you care? Then we're going to turn it over to topics 2 and 3 to Tim and Jason. And that's really the meat of our presentation because those two are the subject matter experts on developing and defending costs and rates. So they're going to talk to you about what are the best practices in developing those costs and rates? How do you do it? What are the tips that they use when representing A&E firms and government contractors? And then if you get audited, what are the best practices there? How do you defend those rates in front of a DCAA audit or in front of an agency audit if you're getting audited by the agency itself? So, and at the very end, like I said, we're going to try to leave about 10 minutes or so for some Q&A, and we're all willing to stay after the hour if need be to answer any questions you might have. So next slide, please. So we're going to talk about allowable costs. Dana, you can go to the next slide as well. So FAR Part 31, let's talk about that real quick. If you've done government contracts for about 5 minutes, you've heard of FAR Part 31. And FAR Part 31 establishes a framework that tells contractors when their costs are allowable. And by allowable, it means will the government pay you for whatever costs you're asking to get paid for? So obviously allowable costs are very, very important. You want to make sure your costs, and this is very, very fundamental, but you'd be surprised that I have a lot of contractors that look at me about allowable costs and they say they've never heard of them. They don't really care about them. They think every cost is allowable. And that is simply not true on a federal contract. So it's very important to understand what costs are allowable pursuant to FAR Part 31 and which costs are not allowable, because not allowable or unallowable costs, you're not most likely going to get paid for those costs. So FAR Part 31 will answer all of your questions about what is allowable and what is not. So allowable costs are a little bit different and they apply differently to different contracts. So the government's going to look at cost allowability at two primary junctures in the lifespan of a federal contract. First and foremost, they're going to look at whether costs are allowable or not allowable at the time you submit your proposal or bid, right? So whenever you prepare your proposal or your bid, you submit it to the government to compete for a project. The government at that time, for the most part, will look at those costs in the face of your bid proposal as to whether they're allowable or not. All right, so that's the first time they're going to look at it. The second time they're going to look at it, and again, this is all kind of fundamental. The second time they're going to look at whether costs are allowable or not allowable is when they're going to pay you, when you submit an invoice. And if on the face of that invoice you're asking for costs that are not allowable, you're most likely not going to get paid for those. So as a contractor submitting bids and proposals and submitting payment applications, you want to be very, very cognizant of what costs you can charge to the government and which costs you're going to get paid for. The third time, which is not listed here, that Tim and Jason will talk about as to whether costs are allowable or not, that the government will look at them, is when you get audited, right? So they're going to look at costs again if you ever get subject to an audit. So they're very, very important, and you need to have a cost accounting system set up for the entire project from the beginning when you're bidding it and submitting bids or proposals to the time you're submitting invoices to the very end of the project where you may get audited. It's very, very important to make sure that your costs are allowable throughout the entire lifespan of a contract. There are 3 wickets that you've got to meet to satisfy FAR Part 31 with regard to your costs or rate. And you've heard these terms before. 1, for costs to be acceptable, we'll call them under FAR Part 31, they've got to be allowable, which means they've got to be allowable under the FAR. Number 2, they've got to be reasonable, which means they've got to pass a reasonable person test. And number 3, they've got to be allocable, which means they've got to be allocable to the particular contract that you're working on. All right, so very, very important that you need to hit all 3 wickets to have costs to be acceptable under FAR Part 31. Allowable, reasonable, and allocable. All right, so FAR Part 31 then divides costs and rates up into 3 other buckets, right? They divide them up into costs that are always allowable, number 1. And Dana's going to talk a little bit more about these 3 different buckets. Costs that are always allowable, costs that are never allowable, or just plain old unallowable. And then there's costs that are in a 3rd bucket called limited allowability. And those are costs that are allowable sometimes under some circumstances or under or above some magnitude, and sometimes they're not allowable. So 3 different buckets of costs covered by FAR Part 31. Next slide, please, Dana. So that's the big picture when you're looking at FAR Part 31. Are costs allowable, reasonable, and allocable? In which category or bucket are they going to fall your costs and rates going to fall into? Are they allowable, expressly unallowable, or of limited allowability? So before I turn this over to Dana to talk more about costs, which are allowable, reasonable, and allocable, I have some fact or fiction slides or bullets I just want to go over with you real quick to put in perspective, how does FAR Part 31 affect particular contracts that you may be working on? So the answer to this is either fact or fiction. And some people, you'd be surprised when you ask them these questions about FAR Part 31. They say fact when it's really fiction, and vice versa. So bullet number 1, FAR Part 31 applies equally to firm fixed price and cost type contracts. Is that fact or fiction? That's a fiction, right? FAR Part 31 is meant to apply to contracts across the board, but they apply much more rigidly and zealously to cost type contracts, cost plus contracts, time and materials contracts, where cost is the basis of what you're billing the government for. They do apply to firm fixed price contracts, but much less so, because when the government agrees to pay you firm fixed price, they don't really care what your cost is. They care what the price is that they've agreed to pay you. Bullet 2, FAR Part 31 applies whenever a cost analysis is required at both the pricing and payment stage of a contract. That's fact. Like if cost is an element of your bid and your proposal, you're submitting a cost plus bid, and or your costs at your invoice stage are based on time and materials, absolutely FAR Part 31 applies. Bullet 3, cost analysis and price analysis are the same thing. And I get a lot of people that confuse cost and price. They are absolutely different. Cost is what it costs you to do something out of pocket, how much you pay to do something. And obviously your price is what you're charging the government for those efforts. So completely different. Selling a commercial item or service at a fixed price allows you to avoid the cost principles. In general, that's fact. In general, it does. If you're selling a commercial item at a fixed unit price that the government agrees to pay you, they don't really care what your costs are. Penalties. Penalties exist for failure to follow the cost principles of FAR Part 31. That's fact. Just like anything else in the federal government contracting world, if you fail to follow the compliance requirements of the FAR, there are penalties, and they can be severe. Finally, there are specific rules for applying the cost principles to construction and A&E contracts. That's fact. There's a specific FAR provision, FAR 31.105, that applies specifically to A&E contracts. In construction contracts, that talks about allowable costs with regard to equipment, rental rates, and things like that. So there are specific FAR provisions that apply specifically to the things that I think a lot of you do on this particular webinar. So I am going to turn it over to my colleague Dana, who's going to talk to you about allowable costs, reasonable costs, and allocable costs.
That's right. Yes. As Doug mentioned, there's 3 big buckets, 3 big qualifiers you have to prove in order to have your cost recoverable under a cost reimbursement contract, and even under fixed price contracts. Because you need to remember, every time there's a modification, you're going to have to prove those costs. So that modification turns into a mini cost reimbursable contract. So first, we need to determine if costs are allowable. They're going to be allowable if, of course, they're reasonable and allocable, which we'll get to. If they're not contrary to cost accounting standards, if those standards apply to your contract, or the generally accepted accounting principles, they need, of course, to comply with the terms of your contracts and aren't limited by circumstances or other parts of FAR Part 31. Next, it needs to be reasonable. So once you determine a cost is allowable, you need to further look at it, and the agencies will look into it more to see, okay, is it reasonable? Is it something you would incur in the ordinary course of business? Were you overcharged? Are you trying to overcharge the government? Were these costs subject to competitive pricing? For example, on these contracts, were your subcontractor prices subject to bidding? The government's always looking to make sure they're paying the best, most competitive price. So the reasonability factor really comes down to, it's fairly common sense, but is it a reasonable amount to pay, even though it is allowable under the contract? Next, they're going to look at, is it allocable? This is pretty self-explanatory. Is it something you can actually charge to this contract? Of course, you can't charge costs that were from other jobs on other sites. You can't charge costs that are just unrelated to the work. And it has to, of course, be incurred specifically to benefit the government in completing the project. And next, as Doug mentioned, there's a whole spectrum of allowability. There are expressly allowed costs, those that are expressly unallowed, and then limited allowability, which will depend on the circumstances and is highly fact specific. So we made a list here. We're not going to go through all of them, but we wanted to give examples of all of these different types of allowable costs. Keep in mind, all of these costs are specifically defined under FAR Part 31. So when you see something like pre-contract costs, that's not a whatever you want it to be type of situation. That's very specific and actually quite narrow definition that will be allowable in some cases and not in others. Here, allowable costs, if you meet that rigid definition, if these are costs that were incurred during negotiation, that you incurred in anticipation of meeting hard contract delivery deadlines early on the project, they might be recoverable. Also, pretty straightforward. All direct costs you incur, such as materials, rental costs, those are of course going to be expressly allowable. Now, there's also expressly unallowable costs. Bad debts, entertainment costs, lobbying costs, things that are unrelated to the contract. Cost of alcoholic beverages, a lot of these are straightforward, but not always. And then this middle ground, this is where it gets a little bit trickier, and you need to know your contract, you need to know the project scope of work, and really just what the FAR says. So again, these will be highly dependent on how they're defined. So limited allowability can be for contingencies, depreciation, employee morale, health and welfare. Some of these programs will be covered if you meet the categories. For example, the employee morale, health, welfare, food service, and dormitory costs has, I think, 6 different subsections that you need to meet to make sure you can actually qualify for this. Again, the list goes on. So we'll see, for example, here, the last one, professional and consultant service costs. For example, on a termination for convenience, you can recover certain consultant costs to help prepare that termination settlement proposal. But if you're just using a consultant in the day-to-day work, you can't regularly invoice that on a progress payment invoice. And here we go, some more. So selling costs, taxes, termination costs, travel costs. Of course, you can't charge for travel if that's not a line item, if it wasn't something you bid, and it will be highly dependent on circumstances. I'm going to turn it over now to get more into the nuts and bolts of all this. We're going to go to Jason and Kim.
Hey, good morning, everybody. Good afternoon, wherever you're at. As we're getting into this, next slide, please. We doing it here? There we go. Okay. Your cost accounting system is key to everything here. And the purpose of it is to allocate your direct and indirect costs to a final cost objective, which has varying different pieces. It could be the customer, and it could be as low as a work order within that contract, depending on how it's structured. Jason?
Yeah, I mean, 2 things to kind of be aware on this is, DCAA or any agency, when they look at your accounting system, they want to make sure you're able to track your costs to that specific contract. You're not commingling costs between multiple contracts. You're able to definitize what cost is going to what contract, if it's an overhead to an G&A. But the other thing that you also want to take in consideration is your accounting structure, your chart of accounts. Do you have accounts to track your unallowable costs? Are you putting costs, like all your travel costs, into one account, whether it's allowable or unallowable? So those are things to really be aware of whenever you're looking just at your cost accounting system. Go ahead to the next slide.
Okay, allocating costs to the right buckets. What do we mean? It's either a direct cost or it's an indirect cost. Even within the direct cost, you can have categories of cost that may be in the contract that need to be treated as direct. In other contracts, it's going to be an indirect. Jason?
Yeah, so like when you're determining if it's a direct cost or indirect cost, first thing you want to do is look at your contract. Your contract's going to kind of really dictate what's going to be direct. Some costs generally could be an indirect, but an example, like if a software cost, if we have some clients that work with the Pennsylvania Turnpike, and there's a software specifically identified to that turnpike. Well, if that's the only contract that you're doing is one contract with the turnpike, try to get that into your contract as a direct cost instead of an indirect cost that's going to be allocated. Then same thing with your indirect costs, your overhead costs, again, your software costs, it's there to service multiple contracts. If you have just a single rate, everything's going to go into one bucket. But if you do have multiple rates with like an overhead and G&A, you want to make sure you're tracking those costs and putting them in that correct bucket. Your software costs going to overhead, maintenance costs, things of that nature, G&A costs, or kind of like your cost of just being in business, your accounting department, your HR department, some of your business insurances, business taxes, things of that nature.
Next slide, please. Okay, through our experiences, some of the common mistakes we see in the allocation of costs to the right buckets is, during the proposal process, you really want to make sure you identify what are all the specific costs of that contract, especially if you've got unique costs that are only going to be for that contract, not used elsewhere. Your indirect costs, again, the allocation between, if you've got multiple pools, allocation between the pools, you've got office space, you've got other things, how much of that belongs in overhead, how much of that belongs in G&A. And then know your drivers. Constantly review your cost drivers. Are these drivers really beneficial to our business and our customers? And knowing that is a way of managing your costs and also increasing your ability on recovery.
Yeah, and that's the nice thing with government contracting is, you see your indirect rates. You have to have your indirect rate schedule. If you're commercial, a lot of times some companies don't even know, they just see money in the bank, so they're like, we're making money. Whereas when you're doing work for the government, they're laying it out there for you, so you know where your costs are going. If your overhead rate is extremely high, well, why? It's like, okay, well, we don't have much direct labor, our direct jobs aren't there, or, why are we spending so much money on marketing, on advertising, on entertainment? Those costs are things that can drive up your rates that you don't even realize. Then the other thing that, you always need to watch is, again, with your accounting structure, if you're putting all your costs into one account and not breaking out your allowable, well, when DCAA or, another agency auditor comes in and they look at that, they're going to have you in a higher risk because you're not segregating your costs between allowable and unallowable. And what's going to happen is sometimes they're going to look at those accounts, and if they only do a small selection and find unallowables, well, there's a chance they may just apply that percentage and saying, hey, we found 20% of our testing on this account to be unallowable. Well, we're going to apply that to this whole account. So they could possibly be disallowing more costs than necessary if you would have your staff, your accounting department, your finance department, whoever, or even, just the employees learn what's allowable, what's unallowable with FAR 31 and start identifying those costs. And then you show to the auditors, like, yes, we review any invoices come in, we segregate these costs to direct, overhead, G&A, unallowable. And those things help things in the long run by taking that step up front.
And what also plays in here that's important goes back to the reasonableness test. Know your cost drivers. So if best example I can give, we had a client once that they owned all their buildings. It was a manufacturer, but still the principle applies. And they were charging the government market rate for the lease. Well, you're not allowed to do that. If you own the building, you can only charge the government the cost of ownership, which is your depreciation, your maintenance, and utilities. Another example is they were using high-end vehicles for transportation from warehouse to warehouse when they could have gotten away with a basic GM or Ford pickup truck. So the government disallowed the difference between that Ford pickup truck and that Cadillac SUV that they were using. So these are things that you need to look at. What are our costs? What's driving our costs? And is it reasonable and prudent for our business? Next slide, please. Okay, another mistakes in preparing negotiating contracts. Here we run into this a lot. When we go in and look at a client and they want us to look at their numbers, and we find out that they're running things through the company that they aren't accounting for properly or shouldn't be running through the company, or they don't have their costs in the right cost pools. And so when the government comes in for an audit, the government finds all these issues, as Jason said. If you get everything, in one bucket, you've got rent in one bucket, yet rent should be split between overhead and G&A, or a portion of it, you have a lot of idle space, the government will not pay for idle space, then they're going to disallow and they'll apply a percentage, whether it's really what should be done or not. But if you had been on top of that, you could have had that taken care of. Then in your RFP, you get the RFP through, you really need to spend a lot of time understanding what all the contract line items are and that you fully understand those. Is a loaded rate or an unloaded rate the appropriate thing? What escalation factors should we be putting in our out years to make sure we get coverage of those costs?
Yeah, and some other things, whenever you're looking at future costs or even just current, when you're preparing, review if you have a software contract for the next 3 years, look at what's the escalation that you're going to be paying. Are you paying, $5,000 each year for this software, or are they going to charge you $6,000 next year, or $7,000? So look at what you currently have, for when you're developing your future rates. Go out and, start reaching out on, like, for health insurance, and, reaching out and be like, hey, what's the projected increases every year? Looking at salary surveys, what are they saying the inflation or cost of living adjustment is going to be? And then also the other biggest thing is you always have to look at your historical. Are you historically seeing your cost increase 5, 6, 7%? Yet your contracting officer, when you're going negotiations, they may say, we want 2 or 3, but you can show them, be like, hey, here's what we're projecting our salaries to be. This is what the market's projecting. Here's what historically we've been seeing. We've been seeing 6, 7%, not 2 or 3%. At some point it does become a business decision. Are you willing to go lower? But the more information you have to going in there, the better. And then the one other thing to look at is on your prior audits that you may have, whether it's a financial audit or a DCA audit or any kind of, were there findings? DCA is going to come in, they want any kind of audit report. Did you have findings before? Have you addressed those? Are they in process of being handled? Are they, have they been rectified? The other biggest thing is, real quick on, prior, whenever Tim brought up about rent, cost of ownership is what you can charge if you own a building. Well, I know one issue that a lot of companies do, they make the company pay for all the taxes, they make the company pay for all the insurances, they make the company pay for all the maintenance, but then they charge a rent. Well, there's nothing there to offset that rent expense because the company's already paying for it. So that's why, a lot of companies see their rent, whether it's fair market or very below market, there's no cost to offset that rent because the company's already paying for it. The ownership group isn't.
And the key point here with the RFPs, where a lot of companies make a mistake, they don't bring the finance team in at the very beginning. Once you've decided to bid on this thing, it's key to be financed. Where a lot of mistakes get made, companies wait till the last minute and they take their proposal, they've done all the technical and everything, and they throw it over the fence to the finance department to prepare the financial numbers the day before the proposal's due. That's just setting yourself up for problems. It's key to have the finance group involved in the RFP process from the beginning. Next slide, please. Okay, again, continuing with the RFP, you know, another thing with a lot of companies don't realize, just because the government comes out and says, we want a fixed price contract, well, that may not be the best vehicle for what they want to try to accomplish. You as a contractor can always go back and say, hey, you know, we're looking at this, maybe this needs to be more of a T&M contract, or maybe we do a mixture of fixed price cost plus to accomplish what you want. Be prepared to explain why. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but there's nothing that says you can't go in and make recommendations. The other thing is, if you do submit questions related to the proposal, the RFP that's sent out, recognize that any of those questions are made public to everybody. So be careful what you put in your questions, that you don't give away your company's position. Then the right people in the negotiations, it's very important here. The people that are sitting down with the government across the table, they really need to know the company's structure, the company's cost structure, their experience. They've got to be a strong representative of the company and a strong negotiator.
Yeah, and I think whenever you go to the next slide, yeah, you know, the key in anything is making sure everyone is available, everyone's on board. Because you can't have one side of your team having part of the information, the other side having the other, and there's no communication in between each other. Those are where you see companies getting in trouble, whether it's a defective pricing or just poor bidding, just because no one knows what the other side's doing.
Yeah, it's definitely a team effort, and doing a red team tag before you submit your proposal is key. And a lot of times what we do with companies who do proposals, we take all the requirements of the RFP and have it up on the walls, and we check off to make sure that we actually addressed everything within that RFP. Okay, we're going to now roll into audits. So what are your rights and what are your responsibilities? Okay, there are essentially, you know, most audits, you know, of course, you want to make sure that what's going on there, but the reality is it's incumbent upon you to ensure that this audit's following the way it's going. And as the bottom sentence there says, most management will think an audit with no exceptions is or significant finding a successful audit. The reality is, while the title of this thing said Audit-Proof, because you never know the competency level of the auditors you're dealing with, there's no such thing as audit-proof. The best you want to do is be able to mitigate everything and then stand up. Next slide, please. So there are 10 key steps, and what you're going to see in these next two slides is the 10 keys. Beyond that are several slides that gives you much more detailed information for each one of these steps. But you have the right to ask for an entrance conference to find out what the audit's all about. You want to appoint a liaison, somebody within the company that knows the company, knows who to talk to, who's going to be the intermediary, who's going to work with the auditors, and the auditors have to go through that one point of contact. Never let the auditors wander your facility unaccompanied, and never let them interview one of your people without somebody else being there. That's just asking for trouble. You got a management team you need to put together, establish an accurate and accessible record keeping system. And that record keeping means recording everything that the government asked for and what you give the government and responses back. Be responsive to the government.
Yeah, I think one of the most important things is asking for that entrance conference. You know, understand what's expected up front. You know, you don't want to be going into this blind. You want to go out to the DCA website, you know, depending on what kind of audit they're doing, go out there and get the audit program. See what are the auditors supposed to be looking at, because, you know, limit what you give them. If they're asking for this, just give them that. Don't be like, oh, well, we'll just give you everything, because you give them everything, they're going to look into everything.
And that will always trigger a follow-up review, because they'll find something they think they need to audit.
Yeah.
Next slide, please. So maintain that detail log, the record keeping, because as many times we've gotten something back for the government and they're saying, well, you didn't provide this information. because we had a detailed log, we can tell them exactly who provided it, when, and what was it, and have that copy of that document that was provided. Always keep a copy of everything. Do not, like I said, do not let the audit exceed the audit agreed scope. Insist on, a list of who they want to talk to. Review the preliminary findings. It's entirely up to you. You have to respond. You should get a draft report. You should respond to everything, whether you agree or disagree. And then insist on that exit conference. You want to make sure that your comments and responses to any findings they have are actually made part of the report.
Yeah, I mean, the detailed log is extremely important. I mean, we've seen with many clients, DCA is no different than, probably your company or other companies, they get turnover. They had an auditor on there for the last couple of months. Well, they left, and now all of a sudden a new person comes in and they're like, well, hey, I need this, I need this, I need this. And you're like, well, this is the third time I already provided it to you. Well, if you got the log and be like, no, we've already given that to you, why aren't you having it? What are you doing with our information if we provide it and you don't have it? The exit conference is just as important as the entrance conference. DCA is going to give you a chance. They're going to say, okay, here's what we found. It gives you a chance to look at it, to respond. And, sometimes DCA might take it out and be like, okay, yes, we see where you're coming from. And they may remove it, or worst case, if they leave it in, they'll at least have your response in there. Those are important things for the CO to look at, and to have it in there is documented, whether you agree or disagree.
Just remember that don't let DCA run roughshod on you, or any government agency run roughshod. You have the ability to control this process. And DCA audit programs are all on their website, so you can get a copy and know exactly what they're supposed to be looking at. And that's how you control what we call audit creep, because they'll do it. And so you're the one that has to be, and that's where your liaison is important. That's the person that should be doing that.
I mean, because, remember, your ultimate negotiation or determinations is with your CO. It's not DCA. Sometimes DCA likes to think that they have the final say on, your system or anything. They don't. I mean, they're there to audit. They're supposed to be independent. But, sometimes, auditor thinks they may make those decisions, but it's ultimately up to your CO. So that's why you want to have things documented, have your responses in there. So then, your CO will see that for whenever you do go into those negotiations.
The other thing to remember, and I see it out on LinkedIn all the time in other areas, there is no such thing as a DCAA approved accounting system. DCA cannot and is not allowed to approve any accounting system. All they can do is point out where there's shortcomings or whatever, and identify where they think the systems do not meet the FAR requirements. Your accounting system is your decision, how it's structured and everything. And they cannot tell you got to use QuickBooks, or you got to use Jamis, you got to use Delta. They can't tell that, nor can they certify your accounting system. So if somebody comes in and is trying to sell you, I can give you a DCAA certified accounting system, show them the door.
Yeah. I mean, I think one other thing on here that's really not fully is one of the steps, but your documentation. And I'm not just talking about detailed log of what you gave to the auditors, but you're supporting, making sure you have all your invoices, scan everything in. They like having things now more digital because, hey, let's face it, they come in 5 years, 6 years later, that gas receipt paper's now blank because it wore out. Get those things scanned in. If you're travel, making sure you got your travel logs, purpose of the travel trip. So those are,
documentation is key to protecting your company.
Yeah.
So the slides that follow after this are all informational for you, where I take each one of those 10 steps and just put a lot more specificity to them. So this is the end of our little shindig. Questions, I guess, at this point.
I guess go back to Whitney to.
Yeah, see, we got questions out there.
No, that was great. Yeah, and feel free to use the chat, everyone, and to ask any questions. I think we have a few coming in. But Tim, I think you hit a really solid point when you're talking about not waiting till the last minute to talk with your pricing and your finance team to load your rates, because that can absolutely destroy your overall bid. I think that's you need to say it louder for the people in the back of the room. I think it's a very powerful statement. So we do have a couple of questions. This one's coming in from Jim. So what? I don't know if I'm getting any feedback. But anyways, what guidance can the panel provide for offices that were small businesses and have been acquired by large businesses, and large businesses do not have much federal prime contracting experience? The legacy small business wraps are not sufficient to cover large
To the
business
small
costs
businesses.
for doing business.
You want to answer that?
I mean, the biggest thing I think, so if I understand, so the small business was a government contractor, they got bought out, but the company that bought them out really does not do government contracting. The biggest thing is just making sure that your initial team is active, because sometimes what we've seen is, if they're more of a commercial based, they don't understand the commercial world, and they try to treat the government world like a commercial world, and they're two different. So, I think, during those acquisitions or afterwards, and we actually have a client right now that's going through the same thing, but luckily they left the management team of the smaller company in place. So they reached out with the new parent company and brought in people like us, or attorneys that specialize into the government contracting, of educating them. I mean, I think probably the biggest thing is just educating the parent company. This is what a government world is like, and what's involved in when you're doing government contracting, and teaching them what's unallowable, what's allowable.
And also letting them know that when the government writes a contract, you perform to the contract. They can't go in and say, well, we think we can give them this better product or this better service, but that wasn't what was called in the contract. And you go through that expense, your parent has you go through that expense, is not part of the contract. The government's not going to pay you for it. So you educating the parent or getting people in to come educating parents is going to be key to success. Okay, another question?
Yep, we do. This is coming from Ed. In general, what business development costs are allowable, and what are unallowable?
In general, BD cost is a G&A cost. It would be part of your G&A pool. Your efforts to go out and obtain work is an allowable cost, but it has limitations. So if your guys are going out and wining and dining different prospective clients, that's not going to be allowable. But if it's just the effort to find the opportunities and bringing those opportunities in and going through the development of those opportunities, that part would be an allowable cost. So it's a mixed bag as to what you can and cannot charge through. But for generally, the B&D effort is looked at as a general administrative effort. It's an effort that you have to do just to be in business. And the government's willing to pay its share of that. The other thing to watch is if what you're going after is something that the government would have no interest in and would not benefit the government, then that cost itself, the government will not want to share in. So if you've got commercial efforts that have nothing to do with anything state or federal government wants or desires, you need to segregate that from your other business development cost and treat it as an unallowable cost related to government rates. Okay, next question, I guess.
What do you find in your experience in dealing with contractors is the most common weak spot in developing the rates and the costs? And for example, and what is, and the second part of that is, what is the common best practice they can implement in improving their rate and cost development?
The biggest things that I've always seen, and I touched about on a couple things, is not having a good accounting structure. Very limited number of accounts. I use travel as a good example because you got the travel regulations of what you can charge for certain cities when you're traveling, and they just put all those costs into one bucket. They're not properly reviewing their travel for, when an employee goes out and travel, and while they may have a beer with dinner, which the company wants to pay, allow them, that's fine, but they don't scrub that expense report, and they charge that alcohol in through their travel. Or putting the purpose of that travel trip. They went to, they went to Florida for a training. Well, they just didn't really put anything, and DCA will come in and be like, well, what was the purpose of this trip? They're going to disallow it because there was no purpose of that trip.
There's another issue there in the travel that we've seen hit companies where their customer at a last minute says, we need you here tomorrow. And, you are looking for airfare, you're looking for everything, and there's nothing available to meet that time frame, and they're insisting on it. And you have to fly business class to first class to get there. You have to stay in a more expensive hotel because maybe there's a conference going on and everything is booked up. If you document all that, document the emails that came in and told you, we need you there tomorrow. It costs this, that, and whatever. You have a better chance when DCA comes in audit later of maintaining and recovering that cost because it was customer driven, not something that you did. And one of the other things too that we see a lot of, is especially with the smaller companies, is their finance people and even their people not really understanding fully what the cost accounting regs are, what the government will and will not accept. And so they end up running stuff through the company that really shouldn't be run through the company, or can be run through the company, but need to be pulled out and put down as an unallowable. So they're not really scrubbing their costs the way that they should to make sure, and they're not maintaining a good history of previous contracts they worked on. Your past performance are very important. Your history in those areas, what have you found and what is your experience, especially if you're bidding on a follow-on contract or a contract for similar services, having that historical data saying, hey, we were able to do it at this, it passed, it all was sustained and everything. That historical data is also very important when you're putting a proposal together to back up why you're asking for what your cost buildup is stating.
Yeah, and I think the other best practice is training, or bringing in, consultants such as, me and Tim, or, going out to different training sites and just learning. I mean, you can ask Doug, you can ask Tim and myself. We're still learning the far, even though we've been doing this for many, many years. Tim's a lot longer.
I resemble that fact.
We're still learning, it's always changing. If someone comes in and says, I know everything, they're lying. There's no way you can learn everything. It's documentation, training, and having the right people, having a good attorney in there, having a good consultant that is available for if you have a question, just reach out.
Yeah, having a good consultant and a good attorney in your back pockets is very important because it's a lot cheaper to go ask a question of the attorney or the consultant than it is to deal with an audit issue or even a potential claim by the government against you. So if you have a question, pick up the phone. You don't need an attorney or a consultant that's going to require you to pay them a monthly fee for just sitting around. A good consultant, a good attorney is there at your call and only works when you ask them to work. But it's a lot cheaper having them in your back pocket than it is not.
So we got a couple more questions, but I need to wrap up, and then we're happy to stay a few minutes afterwards
Yeah.
to close out.
Yeah, we're here. We can answer those questions after the wrap up.
All right. Great. So, Bree, I don't know about you, but I'm getting some feedback on my end. There we go. All right. So thank you, Doug, Dana, Tim, and Jason. That was a great presentation. And thank you, everyone, for participating in today's session. I hope you all found it insightful. So we are committed to bringing you more content and fun events as we wrap up this year and we look into 2024. So our next First Friday session will be on Friday, January 5th. As always, all registered participants will earn one PDH certificate. And so learn about attracting and securing transitioning military talent with our presenter, Ben Wham from Global Recruiters out of Charlotte. So registration is open now. And so are you interested in sharing your knowledge on current educational topics for our First Friday series with our SAME members? So we are accepting presentation applications starting for next year. So please visit our website so you can submit your topic today. And sponsorships are going to be available to help support our ever-growing popular program. So please join us as we celebrate our achievements for the 2023 Leadership and Mentoring Program in our graduating class next week at Maggiano's in Tysons. Our keynote speakers can be Colonel Joe Geary, the Executive Officer for the Administrative Assistant for the Secretary of the Army at the Pentagon and former Commander and District Engineer for USACE Savannah District. So we're also celebrating Dana Molinari, who was presenting during today's webinar as one of our graduating members. So congratulations, Dana.
Great program. Yes.
So join us for our fun evening and support the graduating local LMP class. And we're also currently accepting the DC Post Annual Award nomination applications for our DC Post Annual Awards program. So nominate high achieving and celebrate their achievements during our awards program in January, along with our Military Service Branch Awards and our new DC Post Board installation. So our awards program registration also starts today. So details are also on our website. And so we have 2 events hosted by SAME National that should add to your calendar. The deadline for abstracts to present at SAME JETC that will be held in May this year is quickly approaching. You can submit your topics no later than Thursday, January 4th. You can learn more on the Joint Engineering Training website at samejetc.org. Quickly approaching is the Career Transition Workshop, and the virtual sessions begin on January 16th, and then in person will be held in Maryland mid-February. You can attend our First Friday program to learn more about how to attract and secure transitioning military talent. This event is for those that would like to leverage the skills and accomplishments of transitioning military, as well as those in the military or civilian government that are looking to start a career in the private AEC industry. We would also like to make sure you're aware of some of the upcoming leadership deadlines. The National Leadership Development Program is still open and applications are due tomorrow. These are for mid-level career development and is part of our national program that includes a rigorous year-round program that connects other posts and leaders through our global posts. And then our local DC and Nova Post Leadership and Mentoring Program applications are due on December 15th. This is a year-long program for young professionals, SAME members 39 years and younger, and those from any posts may join. but you must be able to join the local area for in-person meetings. So anybody at your firm, please encourage them to join our next class starting in 2024. So please feel free. Here are some of the other upcoming events. So our full calendar is available on our website for more upcoming events and news. So thank you all again for attending our first Friday. And we had a great bunch of panelists. They will stay on to answer any additional questions. So please look out for document delivery with a subject line for slides, your PDH certificate, and opt-in registered participants today. And we will post a recording on our DC on our website later on this month. So have a great weekend, everyone, and we look forward to seeing you at our next event in 2024. So thanks again.
Thanks, Whitney.
All right.
Thank you.
We still
Okay,
have
you said you had a couple extra questions.
we did. So hang on. Let me.
I have them here, Tim. These are softball questions for you real quick. Is interest paid as part of a loan to purchase equipment allowable? And then question 2, you can probably handle it at the same time. They have a PM software subscription paid at the company level and want to distribute that to multiple jobs that change all the time. So how do they best do that?
Well, the first question, the interest is the government won't pay interest. That's just straightforward. That's one of their expressly unallowables. But as far as the software, that would go into your overhead. If you're using a multiple contracts, you would spread the annual cost of that over the years as part of your overhead cost pool. So you would get recovery through your overhead rates on that.
And I think their question is if their jobs go from 20 jobs in January to 10 jobs in May and then 30 jobs in November, how do you best apply that overhead rate to multiple jobs monthly?
Well, the government makes you work with a 12-month period for your rates. You cannot adjust them monthly. So if you do what's called predetermined rates, you tell the government that, well, at the beginning of the year, this is what we're looking at. Our rates are going to be for the next year. Those are the rates you use. Now, it is incumbent upon you to monitor what's going on. Just because the government approves your predetermined rates doesn't mean they're fixed. Because if there is a significant change in your cost structure because you went from 20 jobs to 10 jobs, so now your indirect labor has gone up because you've got people who are normally direct or idle, and that's going to make your overhead rate go up, once a quarter, once every 6 months. Then if you have a significant change, you want to go back to the government and say, hey, this is what's happening. And for us to get recovery, you want to put that through and as a new set of rates, and vice versa. If you go from 10 jobs to 30 jobs, you've got a lot more direct labor, your overhead rate's going to go down because your base is higher. And you're going to want to go back and say, hey, we thought we were only going to have 15 jobs for the year. Now we've got 30 jobs. We've got, our overhead rate has gone down from 50% to 25%. We want to use that on things going forward. If you have that, you don't adjust your rates and you're going after negotiated fixed price contracts and you're using that higher rate that you projected for the year, even though your rates are down because you've got a lot more work, that knowledge the government will look at and say, wait a minute, you knew and you went ahead with the higher rates, we're going to hit you with a potential defective pricing issue.
I mean, that's the other biggest thing is when you're projecting out your rates for the following year, you should be taking into account, like, so if hey, the first quarter, we're going to have 20 jobs and then we're going to be slower for 2 months. It's going to go down to 10, then it's going to pick back. Well, that should be part of your budgeting. That should be in your planning for that following year. So when you account for your rates for that whole year, there's going to be ups and downs every month. Some months might be higher, some months might be lower, but it should be by the end of the year at a level. What kind of Tim's talking about is those unknowns. So you projected for those contracts, like, okay, we're going to have these contracts for the first half of the year, and then this, and then all of a sudden something changes. you got more contracts than you were budgeting for, or you were going after this big contract, you didn't get it. That's when you need to kind of, why you monitor your rates and be like, hey, government, we were anticipating this, well, this didn't happen, or this happened that we weren't expecting. So our rates went significantly up or down. But just because you have fluctuations month to month, that should be part of your budgeting if you know.
It all gets into your planning and understanding what your business is, and then monitoring as you go through the year to make sure you're not getting any major significant changes because either work went down or work went up. And you have the right then to go back, and basically you're required to go back and tell the government, yeah, we gave you these predetermined rates, but this and this happened. That's the impact. We want to use these rates going forward, whether they're higher rates or lower rates.
Yeah. Because government's not going to want to see you submitting new rates every month, every quarter. They're going to look at you and be like, well, why are you constantly changing your rates?
We actually had a client doing that.
Yeah.
Every 3 months they were using different rates. And then the government came in and said, whoa, wait, whoa. No, we want 12-month rates. And only when there's a significant, when we talk significant, we're talking 15, 20 point significance in the change of rates, percentage wise, that, is fixed. So if you had planned one set of rates on a level of work, and then that changed significantly down, and you're not going to have that level of work, you need to let them know that you need to adjust things.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, especially if you have a cost reimbursable, the government, one, doesn't want you to owe them a lot of money, and two, they don't want to have to pay you a lot of money because your rates changed. They want to try to keep that over under bill at the end of the year to a minimum.
Where it kicks in the most is when you're doing negotiated contracts, competitively awarded price contracts where the government just asks for a price and you give them that price. That's what they're going to pay regardless what happens to you as a business. And it also means regardless what happens to you as a business is performance. So if you gave them a price and then all of a sudden you realize I can't perform that and they accepted the price, well, guess what? You have to perform regardless, unlike a cost reimbursement contract, which is based off of funding levels. And if the government, you don't work beyond what's been funded. If you do, you risk eating that cost. And if the government decides they don't want to go further or fund any more, you stop work. Yeah. You don't have that flexibility under fixed price contracts.
Okay. Another question?
I think we touched on most of them, but if anybody has any additional questions, if they want to reach out to you afterwards, all your contact information is in the slides.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they could definitely reach out to you directly. So, but that's it. We still have a couple people on here, but so thank you all for joining us today on the last first Friday of 2023, and we hope to see you at the Leadership and Mentoring Program graduation. If not, we will see you in 2024. So thanks again.
Thanks, Whitney.
All right, see you.
See ya. Thanks, Tim. Thanks, Jason.